Well, welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder.
And I'm John Jessup. Well, Jenna, with just 14 days until the midterm elections, both parties are working overdrive to get out the vote.
That's because there is so much at stake this cycle. All 435 members of the U.S. House are up for re-election. And over in the Senate, 33 seats are in play, 26 of them currently held by Democrats. Historically, the party of the president loses a number of seats at this point in the commander-in-chief's term. President Trump, though, is trying to prevent that from happening. He needs to keep a Republican majority in both chambers to keep his agenda moving forward.
Well, we're joined now by Jennifer Wishon and Amber Strong. Amber, in the lead up to the midterms, there's been a lot of talk about the blue wave, but the New York Times had a story headline today: what could hold back a Democratic wave, the economy, confidence, or independence? What's your take? We know that the blue wave that we've heard so much about has now kind of been narrowed to a gap or a blip, but what's your sense now?
Yeah, the new saying is it going to be the blue trickle? But historically speaking and statistically speaking, you have to look at President Barack Obama and presidents who've had similar approval ratings as Donald Trump. Donald Trump's at about 47%. Barack Obama was at about 45% in 2010. And those approval ratings aren't that different. And Barack Obama lost significantly in the House and seats in the Senate. So if we're going to look at statistics, then you can count on at least the blue trickle. And I think there's a misconception when you have the word wave, that people think that it's about this huge gap that's going to happen and Republicans are going to get blown out. It's not about the gap. It's about wins versus losses. So even if it's just a 2% win, if the Democrats are picking up all those House seats that we're looking at, then it's still a blue wave.
Yeah.
Jennifer, to get you to comment on that, Amber just mentioned President Obama, the wave that he experienced in 2006, but actually that was 2010. But I think one of the differences when you look at all these previous waves, whether it was 1994, whether it's 2006 or 2010, that those waves happened during a recession. We are now in an economic boom. So how do you think this is going to play out with regard to President Trump and his Republican majorities in Congress?
Well, I think that the word in that title, in that New York Times story, is economy. And in a lot of these districts, in a lot of these neighborhoods, people are sitting home and they're saying, you know what? I feel good about the economy. Consumer confidence is through the roof. Unemployment numbers have broken records. And, you know, I think people, unless you're super motivated about the culture, about these issues that we've been talking about evening after evening, if you're not really fired up about those and you feel good about the economy, I'm not sure you turn out on Tuesday.
Yeah, and issues. He's certainly out on the campaign trail, touting all of these issues, all of these accomplishments. You know, he was in Texas last night. He's got, I think, 22 more stops before Election Day. So nonstop schedule. Both of you again, and we'll start with Jennifer this time. Do you think this is hurting or helping the president and these Republican candidates?
I think it helps. I think it reminds people that they feel good. They feel good about the economy. They feel good about, you know, the fact that they're going to have a job, that they're, you know, they feel stable economically. That's huge when you think about what families worry about. It also reminds people that this is a president in a historic way who said what he was going to do, and he's done it. He has a record to tick off. And, you know, I think people who are considering voting for Republicans or Democrats, again, if they're not fired up about these cultural issues that we talk about, then I think that this only helps the Republican candidates out there. It motivates the base. They get fired up. The president's coming. The local media is out there. And I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, and Amber, do you think it's also a reminder to people who don't support the president of, hey, I don't support this president, so I better get to the polls as well?
Oh, yeah, so much so that it's becoming a question of who's running anymore. You know, you look and you see President Trump, and it's like, oh, yeah, there's a candidate over there in the back. Oh, he's running. Who am I voting for? It's like almost like President Trump is on the ballot. And for those who are triggered by the sight of President Trump, then that is the motivation to get to the polls and to vote against him and his policies. It's funny, I interviewed the Indiana candidate Mike Braun recently about this very issue. I said, you've aligned yourself so much with the president. Is that going to hurt you? And he said, no, I'm counting on it helping me when people look at the blue collar workers who felt abandoned, who now feel rejuvenated by the president and some of his promises. And I did, remind him, Indiana's a big state. You might get those blue-collar workers, but everyone in the state's not going to be a blue-collar worker.
That's a really interesting race.
For the folks who've been watching Faith Nation, they're familiar with some of the topics that we've been talking about. We've been talking about how anger is really something that's fueling this midterm election. But the Washington Post had an article out today that says that the GOP is basically betting their hopes on fear motivating people to the polls. Jennifer, is this a winnable strategy?
Yes. Satisfied voters tend to not, make sure that they're up early before work to vote on Tuesday or staying late. Fear is a great motivator. In many ways, this, people are talking about how this feels a lot like 2016. In a lot of ways it does, because we're talking about culture issues. And those are the types of issues that motivate people. There are still people on both sides that are fired up about Kavanaugh. People that they're so fired up, and, we're seeing mobs, people attacking elected leaders. And so I think that the fear strategy, the fact that there's 7,000 migrants moving towards the border. Remember in 2016, what did we hear chanted at all of the president's rallies? Build the wall, build the wall. Well, he hasn't built the wall yet, but I think voters who are concerned about that know that Democrats are not going to help him build the wall.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that this is a strategy that worked for them, for Republicans in 2016, and they're betting on it again.
Yeah, we talk about the wall and the caravan. That's I'd like to get your thoughts. Amber, do you think that's going to be a big issue? We know that Kavanaugh is a big issue. We know that the economy and a number of other issues are really important. But what about this caravan?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Democrats have to find their own caravan. They haven't found their caravan. They've tried to tap into health care, and they tried to say, look, you're going to lose some of your benefits. Look, the GOP is going to cut Medicaid. They're going to get rid of everything about Obamacare that you love. But they haven't found their caravan. And then when they try to push back with some of the statistics about fear, it isn't always a winning strategy, right? We saw this with Kavanaugh, for instance. The fear out of that is now my sons have to be worried that, they'll be accused of sexual assault, when realistically it's about a 2% chance that they'll be accused of sexual assault. So if you didn't go to bed thinking that your son was going to be accused of murder, probably not going to be accused of sexual assault. But it doesn't matter, because as a mom, you're feared, you're afraid, and you take that to the polls. And until the Democrats can find their caravan, something that they can pinpoint and say, this is it. The strongest thing I've seen so far is the president himself and that his rhetoric. And is this the new normal that you want? And if they can get a unifying message behind this is the thing that you should be afraid of and the reason you should get to the polls, then they'll be good to go.
Yeah, and Jennifer, this caravan, it's optically, people are making the argument that this is really terrible optics for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, this is October surprise. This is an October gift to Republicans, absolutely. And people, I think people who they worry about national security, people who are concerned about that, people who just want immigrants who support immigration, legal immigration. They want immigrants to come to the U.S. They appreciate the mixing bowl that we are, but they want it to happen legally. And so I think this is a huge gift for Republicans, and we're going to hear the president keep talking about it.
Last question. I want to kind of mix two things here if we can. I definitely want your thoughts as we're 2 weeks away from the midterm elections, but if we can also chime in a little bit on civility, because we live in a polarized America. We've seen things that perhaps we haven't seen play out as vividly as we have before, whether it's Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi being chased down or chased out of restaurants. But how does this all play out into the sense that we're just 14 days away from going to the ballot box? How much are we going to continue to see that? Will that die down? Will that passion perhaps spark something that we haven't yet seen?
Well, that's a good question. 2 weeks in politics can seem like an eternity. A lot can happen between now and then. But I think what we are seeing right now, this has started on college campuses where only one viewpoint is allowed. And we're seeing it spill into the public at large. And I think that so many Americans don't understand the importance of civility. They don't understand the Constitution. They don't understand the value of having different viewpoints. And we're seeing that, among the electorate. And I think that it's I think everyone should be concerned about that. Will it die down? I think that after the midterm elections, it will die down, but I think this is an issue we're going to have to grapple with as a country going forward.
Amber, final thought?
Indeed. I mean, we saw the news this morning about George Soros, someone who funds a lot of democratic strategies, having explosive devices near his home, and Rand Paul coming out strong and saying, this is wrong, and I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. And until we see more Rand Pauls on the GOP side and definitely more on the Democrat side, I don't see it going away after the midterms.
All right.
Well, some in the mainstream media are accusing President Trump and the GOP of fear-mongering and mob-style antics ahead of the midterms. But our next guest says not so fast. Curtis Hauk with the Media Research Center joins us now. And Curtis, thank you so much for joining us, first of all. In your first article, in your latest article, you specifically call out NBC's Chuck Todd. Talk about that.
Yeah, so on Friday's MTP Daily, Chuck Todd has continued what had been going on throughout the week and into this week, this liberal media strategy that you've been seeing in newspapers and on cable news and the broadcast network, talking about the Republican strategy going into the midterms as being one of fear-mongering, xenophobia, mob-style tactics. The Republicans are the ones that are the mob and not the Democrats at all. And so Chuck Todd is saying that, Republicans are engaging in conspiracy theories, and he cites President Trump's rallies as examples of that. But I have to push back on that, because what we've been seeing is, just last night we learned that a brick was thrown through an office at one of Kevin McCarthy's offices. We've had Republican candidates threatened. And that doesn't even start to look at the Kavanaugh protesters or what Maxine Waters said back in June about the need to get in the faces of Republican officials and members of Congress.
Yeah, clearly a lot of examples. Mitch McConnell, another one. In Montana, though, we did see the president. He gave a shout out to Congressman Greg Gianforte, who, as you know, assaulted a reporter. Does Chuck Todd not have a point when it comes to something like that? Exactly.
He certainly does about that, but I think what is usually the case when the president does something that might be unpopular or many people would be considered to be uncivil, then you have the liberal media go overboard reacting to it. You saw last week when the president did this and did the body slam mimic of Greg Gianforte, you had people go out there and mention Ben Jacobs of the Guardian newspaper, who was body slammed by Gianforte, in the same sentence as Jamal Khashoggi, who we know was murdered and butchered in Turkey by the Saudis.
Wow.
In comparing the two, then that just drives people back to the president. So I saw that last week as a classic example of how Trump does something that may not be beneficial to expanding his base, but then the news media sends people back to the president by completely overreacting to a situation and taking his bait. It's another example of the president trying to troll the press, and the press fall for it.
Yeah, and you talk about that. Democrats, as you say, overplaying their hand in a lot of cases. And something that you mentioned in this article is that Democrats, based on Chuck Todd's reporting, a lot of Democrats say that they actually do feel like they admit that they messed up the whole Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation. Curtis, though, we don't hear a lot about that in the media.
Right. It was tucked in the middle of this panel segment talking about Republican fear-mongering and scare tactics and Republicans being the real mob, the Democrats who woke up the Republican base. And that's something that's interesting in the media. I don't think, having been a part of that, having helped wake up the base, the Republican base, so their own opposition, they're trying to be in damage control right now by trying to tamp down on that enthusiasm. And I don't think that's going to work. The more the news media talk down to Trump voters, the more likely, the bigger the chance that they are that they're going to go out there, and they're already voting. Early voting is usually something you would think that benefits Democrats, but in certain states like Nevada, we're seeing it benefit Republicans.
Yeah.
And then you think Republicans traditionally turn out on Election Day because of tradition and all that sort. So we'll see. But again, CNN and MSNBC may try to push this idea of fear-mongering and mob-style tactics, but you just have to go down the list. and look at, Republicans assaulted or how the Kavanaugh protesters were paid, as some have admitted. It's really on the other side.
Yeah. All right. Well, Curtis Hauk with Media Research Center, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
When we come back, why the president is planning to pull out of a nuclear arms treaty with Russia. Vice President Mike Pence says the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi will not go without an American response, but he's declining to say what that response might entail. He made that comment at an event hosted by Washington Post, where Khashoggi worked as a columnist. The vice president's comments come just today after Turkey's president promised to reveal the naked truth on the murder of the Saudi journalist today. Speaking before Parliament, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Khashoggi's murder was premeditated and carried out by a 15-man Saudi hit squad. Reports say 7 of the men belonged to the protection detail of the Saudi crown prince.
My call is first and foremost to Saudi Arabia's King Salman and to senior administration. Istanbul is where the incident took place. Therefore, my offer is for these 15 people, plus 3 people, the 18 arrested, to be tried in Istanbul.
Khashoggi disappeared on October 2nd during a visit to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul.
Well, President Trump plans to pull the United States out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. It was an agreement in the 1980s designed to bring peace to the U.S. and allies in Europe and the Far East. CBN's national security correspondent Eric Rosales reports why the administration wants out of the treaty.
For years, the United States has claimed Russia has violated the INF Treaty for developing and deploying medium-range nuclear missiles. At a press conference in Moscow, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton said that the U.S. is withdrawing from the 30-year treaty.
This is not a subject that arose yesterday. This question of Russian violations is long and deep.
Bolton said a former withdrawal notice has yet to be filed, but he did refer to 6 years of U.S. State Department reports that showed Russia's violations. Prior to the announcement, Bolton said a variety of topics were discussed in meetings, including Russia's interference in U.S. elections.
I can say we're obviously monitoring the potential for foreign interference in our elections across the board very closely. We have 2 weeks to go until the election. I hope there isn't any meddling at all.
News reports out of Moscow claim Putin told Bolton he wants to continue a dialogue with President Trump.
Russia has not adhered to the agreement. This should have been done years ago. Until people come to their senses, we have more money than anybody else by far. We'll build it up.
Putin mentioned possibly meeting Trump on November 11th when the two leaders are in Paris to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. INF stands for Intermediate Nuclear Forces. The treaty was signed in 1987 by President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev, when the two superpowers were trying to end the Cold War. Putin recently made what some are calling are troubling remarks about a possible nuclear war.
The aggressor should know that the retaliation is inevitable and they will be destroyed. And we will be the victims of aggression and rise to the heavens as martyrs, and they will just drop dead.
Hudson Institute senior fellow Richard Weiss feels by leaving this treaty, it opens up other lines of communication for both Russia and the United States.
President Trump is searching for an out-of-the-box approach to some of these issues, and he may want to consider having an arms control treaty with Russia that would include both the intermediate range missiles and the larger ones, but on the common ceiling. So Russia can keep the missile it's developing, but then they'd have just fewer of the longer range ones.
Some national security experts believe that the INF Treaty put the U.S. at a disadvantage. Take, for instance, China, who was not part of the agreement. The country has seen a surge in missile buildup, even hypersonic missiles. The U.S. is now in the process of stepping up its hypersonic research. This year, the Air Force awarded $1.4 billion in contracts to begin working on air-launched hypersonic weapons. John, Jenna?
Eric, so if this treaty put restrictions on the U.S. and Russia, but not other countries, how does this work?
Well, I tell you what, that is the biggest criticism, with these treaties. It is, in fact, that it's because these treaties were up against both China and Russia, that this way that you know, that they didn't have to follow the same suit as both the United States had to follow. This was a very important treaty when both the United States and the former Soviet Union were at odds, but now that's not the case, and we have new adversaries out there and new methods of terror, such as cybersecurity hacking.
So, Eric, this treaty goes back to the 1980s, so I'd have to imagine that it has to be somewhat difficult to dismantle.
Yes, it's a very complicated process out there. Notification of withdrawal from one party to another starts about a 6-month timeline before it's complete. Now, during that time, both the United States and Russia could attempt to negotiate a broader arms deal. That could be even involving China or other nuclear-armed countries to bring them into the mix. So this is something that's going to take a lot of time, at least 6 months.
National Security Correspondent Eric Rosales, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, why political divisions are creating what's being called a new age of outrage. That's next.
While political divisions are growing wider across America, one author says it's giving birth to a new age of outrage.
In his new book, Ed Stetzer encourages Christians to bring their best when the world is at its worst. Charlene Aaron talked about it with him.
Signs of incivility and outrage abound. From our nation's capital, where protesters, angry over the Kavanaugh confirmation process, jammed Senate hallways and interrupted CBN News' coverage of the demonstrations.
Well, today has been one of the rowdiest days during the hearing, both inside the hearing room and outside. The hearing began with the first hour was just very intense between the senators.
To college campuses, where last year rioters virtually took over Berkeley because they wanted to stop a commentator from the conservative Breitbart website from speaking on campus.
It seems that we're in a time when people are increasingly at odds with one another, and it's an outrageous time with a lot of anger.
In his new book, Christians in the Age of Outrage, speaker and author Ed Stetzer points out our country's deep divisions, hoping the church can bring about healing. But before that can happen, he says the church must focus on itself.
I think one of the things that has been important to note in the last few years is that sometimes the political divisions has actually gotten into the church in a way that maybe it hasn't in the past.
Stetzer says Christians can counter the growing outrage we see in our culture today simply by exercising greater spiritual discipline.
My desire is we might act and love and listen and speak more like Jesus would in these situations.
Stetzer, who is also the Billy Graham Distinguished Chair of Church, Mission, and Evangelism at Wheaton College and Executive Director of the Billy Graham Center, says social media is a big part of the problem. He says Christians can hurt their witness by not properly engaging debates on hot topic issues such as gay marriage or politics. He offers a roadmap to navigating online conversations.
We can be in an evangelical echo chamber where everyone sort of thinks like we do, and then we're shocked to find out people have a different worldview, and they do. And we actually found in our research that evangelicals are very likely to mute people or block people who disagree with them. And so you're never hearing different views. So we have almost an undiscipled approach to social media that's alienating our neighbors and building sometimes even divisions between Christians. And what we're calling for in Christians in the Age of Outrage is a change to that, a more thoughtful, biblical, spirit-filled approach that ultimately engages culture more effectively.
He goes on to encourage evangelical Christians to model the message of the gospel.
And so the question is, we have to make choices. How do we speak up for what's right? But also, how do we show and share the love of Jesus in the midst of the brokenness? And I think our research shows that people are saying we've got to see a shift in the way we ultimately engage culture. The division is not helping anybody, and the long term harming the witness of the gospel.
He says the best way to do that is through proper discipleship.
I actually used to listen to a political show, but I found that I couldn't pray for the president at the time and listen to that person because I got so riled up. And so what I had to do is, in my own discipleship, through spiritual discipline, I had to say, that's shaping me in a way that leads me away from what actually the Bible calls me to do. So I quit listening to that program, kept praying for that president, kept speaking up about things that mattered to me, but I was more discipled by my Bible and in the promptings of the Holy Spirit than I was by the radio program, or today it might be the cable news program that I'm watching.
Meanwhile, in this current culture, Stetzer challenges Christians to intentionally live in a way that makes the gospel more appealing.
I don't know that Christians can solve all the outrage issues. I think the culture has just gone, it's turned up the volume to 11, and it's just going all in on the outrage. So what I would say is we need to show a counterculture message. The gospel's always been countercultural, right? It's always shown a different way. And when the world's running this way, the scriptures teach a different way. Jesus calls us to a better way. So I think the better way is not to join in and turn up the outrage volume, but instead to enter in on mission.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News, Wheaton, Illinois.
Yeah, it was a great point he made about, being really careful what you're listening to, what you're watching. I mean, you are what you eat, what you consume.
That stuff feeds your mind and your soul. You're right.
No.
Well, that's going to do it for tonight's Faith Nation.
Have a great evening.